There is a silver certificate in the National Archives printed in 1896 carrying a specific promise, payable to the bearer on demand in silver coin. The promise was federal law. Any American could present the note at a Treasury office and receive actual silver. Millions did. The certificate still exists. The promise does not. By 1963, new printings carried no redemption obligation of any kind. The transition happened in steps, across 9 decades, through administrative circulars and emergency declarations that received no national vote. The paper is still there. The question is what was exchanged when the promise came off. The Coinage Act of 1792 established the American monetary system in writing, down to the weight of each coin. A silver dollar would contain 371.25 grains of pure silver. A gold eagle would contain 247.5 grains of pure gold. Congress fixed the ratio between them at 15:1. The precision was intentional. The founders understood that money without a fixed, physical referent was a promise that could be quietly revised. The official story about the decades that followed is simple: a bimetallic system, stable and transparent, funded by citizens who understood what their money was worth. That version is mostly correct. What it omits is how the system was built to prevent invisible alteration, and what happened when each protection was removed. Silver and gold circulated together for 8 decades. Debts could be paid in either. The mint accepted silver from anyone who brought it and struck it into coin at no charge. Free coinage, which meant the volume of money in circulation expanded when silver production expanded, and contracted when it didn't. Farmers who sold harvest could pay debts in currency that reflected actual productive output. The arrangement was not sentimental, it was structural. By the 1870s, silver certificates supplemented the coins themselves. Each certificate was a paper note issued by the Treasury backed by silver held in government vaults. The text on its face carried a legal obligation, not a decoration. The United States of America would pay the bearer the face value in silver coin on demand. Any holder could present it at a sub-treasury office and walk out with silver. The mechanism was documented, operational, and used. Treasury records from 1885, held at the National Archives in Record Group 53, show approximately $120 million in silver certificates outstanding against silver holdings of comparable value. The liability was named. The backing was counted. The count was published in annual Treasury reports available to any citizen who requested them. That was the system's core claim. The transparency was the promise. Then Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1890, requiring the Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver monthly, paying with Treasury notes redeemable in either silver or gold at the government's discretion. The stated purpose was to support declining silver prices. The actual effect was immediate pressure on gold reserves. Holders of the new notes redeemed them in gold rather than silver, because gold carried higher market value per ounce. The system designed to support silver was draining gold instead. Charles Hamlin, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury from 1893 to 1897, described this precisely in testimony before the House Banking Committee in 1894. His remarks appear in the published committee record, Volume 47. Hamlin stated the Sherman Act created a redemption demand the Treasury's gold reserves could not sustain indefinitely. Month by month, gold left the vaults, while silver accumulated. By early 1893, reserves had fallen below the $100 million threshold that Treasury officials treated as the minimum required to maintain dollar convertibility. The threshold was crossed in April. The math was not disputed. By June 1893, multiple regional banks had suspended payments. Contemporary labour surveys, published by the predecessor, agency to the Bureau of Labour Statistics, estimated unemployment had reached approximately 11% by year's end. The episode was named immediately, the Panic of 1893. Panics implied irrational fear rather than structural failure. The name did specific rhetorical work. The question the name discouraged was structural. Who held the Treasury notes being redeemed in gold? Accounts in the Commercial and Financial Chronicle from July and August of 1893 documented that the largest redemptions were concentrated among Eastern banking houses and major creditors, not small depositors. Institutional holders had watched the monthly reserve reports. They knew the threshold. Treasury redemption ledgers from that period, archived at the National Archives in Record Group 39, show the redemptions concentrated in spring and early summer. Before the public panic, not during it, President Cleveland called a special session of Congress in August 1893 and demanded repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Silver was destroying the gold reserve, he argued, and destabilizing the currency. Congress complied in October. Silver purchasing stopped. Western silver mines that had expanded capacity in anticipation of sustained government demand contracted sharply within 18 months. The Coeur d'Alene district in Idaho and the Leadville operations in Colorado, documented in production records held at the Colorado School of Mines archive in Denver, did not recover their prior output levels. The official record describes a government responding to crisis. The redemption ledgers describe something more specific, a crisis that began when institutions positioned to redeem chose to redeem, and ended when the instrument sustaining silver demand was abolished. The promise printed on the certificates had not changed. What changed was the political will to sustain the system behind it. The buildings from the silver districts are still standing. The ledgers are readable. The Official History of the Coinage Act of 1873 describes a technical administrative reorganization. The bill updated mint procedures, restructured denominations, and cleared obsolete coin types from the standard list. The silver dollar was among the coins dropped. The floor debates in both chambers, published in the Congressional Globe and its successor, the Congressional Record, contain almost no discussion of that specific provision. That is the textbook account. What the legislative record adds is considerably more specific. Senator John Sherman of Ohio managed portions of the bill through the Senate. In 1893, 2 decades after the vote, Sherman told a reporter for the New York Tribune that the bill's effect on silver had not been clearly understood at the time of passage. That interview is cited in the 1894 report of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, which was attempting to reconstruct the Act's legislative history. Congressman Samuel Cox of New York gave similar testimony to the same committee. He had read the bill in full and had not understood that the silver dollar was being eliminated from the coinage. The committee's final report noted this was consistent with the bill's structure. The provision removing silver occupied a single clause in a document running to many pages of administrative detail. The clause did its work without announcement. The people who did understand were specific. William Ralston, president of the Bank of California, had lobbied for silver demonetization through correspondence with Treasury officials beginning in 1869. Those letters are held at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. Ernest Seed, a London bullion broker, visited Washington in 1872 and met with Treasury officials during the period when the Coinage Bill was being drafted. His visit was noted in the Commercial and Financial Chronicle in November 1872, though the precise nature of his consultations was never entered into congressional records. What was documented? The bill passed. The silver dollar was removed. The promise printed on millions of silver certificates had not changed. The legal infrastructure supporting that promise had. Through the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the Bland-Allison Act of 1878 required the Treasury to purchase between $2 and $4 million of silver monthly and coin it into standard dollars, which partially restored silver's presence in circulation. Free coinage, the original right of any citizen to bring silver to the mint and have it struck into legal tender at no charge, was not restored. The volume of silver money remained under federal control, not market control. The distinction mattered enormously to everyone who owed money. A restricted, federally managed silver supply meant prices could be held in ways that consistently favored creditors over debtors. William Jennings. Bryan made this argument precisely at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in July 1896. His speech was not disconnected rhetoric. Bryan argued that the gold standard and the restriction of silver together functioned as a mechanism for transferring wealth from producers to creditors, because scarce money meant falling prices, and falling prices made debts contracted in dollars progressively harder to repay in real terms. The economists who opposed him disputed the remedy. None disputed the arithmetic. Bryan lost the 1896 election. The Gold Standard Act of 1900 formalized what had already been operating practice. The dollar was defined exclusively in gold, and silver's monetary role was permanently subordinated. The Western mining states that had expanded production through the 1880s never recovered their prior output levels. Colorado School of Mines production records, archived in Denver, document the Leadville district's output peak in 1881 and its sustained contraction through the 1890s. The silver certificates remained in circulation. The promise on their face was unchanged. The system behind that promise had been systematically dismantled. Then came 1913. The Federal Reserve Act, signed by President Wilson on December 23rd, created a central banking system administered by 12 regional reserve banks under a federal board. Federal Reserve notes would become the primary paper currency of the United States. The congressional debates on the legislation are published in full in the Congressional Record and remain searchable through the Library of Congress. Early printings of Federal Reserve notes carried explicit text on their face, redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. The promise was printed in the same tradition as the silver certificate before it, a named obligation, a specific backing, a legal commitment visible to anyone who examined the note. The question the new system inherited from the old was the same question the silver certificates had carried since 1878, not whether a promise existed, but whether the infrastructure behind it would be sustained when sustaining it became politically inconvenient. The answer, across the next 6 decades, was filed in steps too small to register as a single definitive event. Most people didn't look. The language on Federal Reserve notes changed in steps small enough that no single revision registered as a definitive break. The 1928 series carried explicit gold redemption text on its face. The 1934 series did not. Treasury Circular 657, issued in January 1934, ended domestic gold redemption following President Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, which had required citizens to surrender gold coins and certificates to Federal Reserve banks by May 1933. The Executive Order was issued under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime statute applied during a peacetime banking emergency. After January 1934, Federal Reserve notes were redeemable in lawful money. Treasury correspondence from that period, held at the National Archives in Record Group 56, clarifies what that phrase meant: other Federal Reserve notes. The promise had become circular. For foreign governments and central banks, a limited gold redemption mechanism survived through the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which fixed the dollar at $35 per troy ounce and made it the anchor currency for international exchange. The conference proceedings are archived at the National Archives in Record Group 56. This arrangement sustained a gold link for 27 years. By 1971, foreign central banks, France most systematically, beginning in the mid-1960s, had drawn US gold reserves from approximately $20 billion in 1958 to under $10 billion. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon announced the United States would no longer redeem dollars held by foreign central banks in gold. The announcement came on a Sunday evening in a nationally televised address framed around domestic inflation and international currency speculators. The gold window closed that night. It has not reopened. The paper trail for each decision is preserved. The Federal Reserve Act debates are published in the Congressional Record. The Bretton Woods proceedings are in Record Group 56. Nixon's 1971 deliberations were declassified in stages through the 1990s and are held at the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. What the documents show in sequence is a system in which the monetary promise was altered at each major crisis point, and each alteration was described in the language of emergency, modernization, or stability, rather than in the language of what was actually being removed. Consider the sequence plainly. In 1792, the dollar was defined by weight in silver and gold, redeemable by any citizen. In 1873, silver's role was removed from law without floor debate on that specific provision. In 1893, the instrument sustaining silver demand was abolished. In 1913, paper currency moved from Treasury issuance to a private banking consortium. In 1934, domestic gold redemption ended. In 1971, international gold redemption ended. At each step, citizens were told the change was necessary, temporary or technical. At no step was the cumulative effect of all prior changes presented as a single public accounting. The official explanation was always the next step, never the distance travelled. Each transition was filed separately and never summarized. Imagine him. There had to be one in every county seat in 1950. A man born in 1860, who had held silver certificates as a young adult, who had read Bryan's speeches and understood the arithmetic, who had watched the Federal Reserve notes arrive and noticed that they still promised gold. He would have seen that promise disappear from new printings in 1934, replaced by circular language referring to other notes. He would have lived past 90 and watched the last gold link sever in 1971 on a Sunday evening address, when his grandchildren asked why the money looked different than it once had. He might have started to explain the silver certificates, the specific text, the redemption windows at the sub-treasury offices, the way the language on the notes had changed step by step. And his grandchildren, educated in schools where monetary history appeared as administrative background rather than contested political argument, would have nodded and changed the subject. Because by 1950, the textbooks had already settled it. The gold standard was an antiquated constraint that modern economies had outgrown. The silver question was a footnote about populist excess. The Federal Reserve was a stabilizing institution. Clean categories. Nothing in the curriculum that would prompt a question about what the words on the old certificates had actually committed the government to, or why those words had been quietly removed. The silver certificates are still in the archives. The Federal Reserve notes from 1928, carrying their gold redemption text, are preserved at the Smithsonian's National Numismatic Collection in Washington. The congressional debates from 1873, 1893, and 1913 are published and searchable. Treasury Circular 657 is filed in the Federal Register. The records are public. The paper that promised silver is still paper. The question it carries is the same one it carried in 1896. Not whether the language changed. It did, in documents anyone can read. But what was exchanged across a century of incremental revision when the promise finally came off the note